Howdy, this is Steve Robbins, and I'm here today with Eric Barker, who is the author of this new book, Plays Well with Others. Um, I've known Eric for several years. We were introduced by a friend who said, you two have to meet each other, and I called him up, and he said, being very low on the agreeableness scale, he said, no, I'm working on a book right now, get lost. And then once his book was done, I was able to interview him for the Get It Done Guy podcast. But he has just released Plays Well with Others, the surprising science behind why everything you know about relationships is mostly wrong. Welcome, Eric.
It's great to be here.
So one of the things that I absolutely love about your books is you give more information in an entertaining, engaging style with lots of nuance from all different perspectives in a way that's super easy to read and absolutely impossible to summarize. Which means we have so much to talk about. I would love to know, in writing this book, what was the most unusual thing that you learned, and why was that unusual and significant for you?
It was really interesting to me writing it during the pandemic. I had actually already decided to write the book about relationships, and then literally 2 weeks after I closed the book deal, California, where I live, locked down for the pandemic. So all of a sudden, I was writing a book about improving relationships scientifically, and it went from, oh, this will be helpful, to, oh, this is going to be essential. And all of a sudden, I really had to. I was a man on a mission. But there were many things that were very surprising to me, because I think the genre of relationship book typically has the scientific accuracy of like a magic 8-ball. And, to actually get some answers was really interesting. For instance, regarding something a lot of people have been dealing with, loneliness, I was shocked to find that on average, lonely people don't spend any less time with people than non-lonely people do, which sounds kind of impossible. Yet we've all felt lonely in a crowd. We've all felt lonely around other people. And that's because loneliness is a subjective experience. Loneliness is not necessarily about being proximate to people. Loneliness is how you feel about your relationships. And so if you feel like you're part of a family, part of a team, part of a group, you can travel and you might want to be with your friends and family, but you still feel connected to them. Versus if you don't feel you have meaningful relationships, you don't have meaningful connections, you can be proximate to people and feel lonely in a crowd. So when we say, the best cure for loneliness is just spend more time with people, sure, that can help, but that doesn't actually cut to the real quick of the problem. The real issue is how you feel about your relationships, how meaningful they are, not necessarily how geographically close you are to people.
So loneliness is almost a narrative thing. It's the story you tell yourself about your relationships. Exactly. It's not the truth of your relationships.
Yeah.
I know one of the things that was a big surprise to me in reading your book is you said loneliness is also a new concept. Like, I would have think this would have gone back millennia.
There's another stunning element. Faye Alberti does research at the University of York, and she's a historian. And she said that before the 19th century, loneliness as an experience almost didn't exist. And that sounds crazy. But again, we were all, before the 20th century, we're all embedded in religions, nations, groups, tribes, communities. And we felt strong bonds to those people. We needed them to survive. So people never felt like they weren't a part of something. You couldn't survive on your own. But it wasn't until the 19th century where we had much more economic success. We could be more autonomous. But with that autonomy came a lot of positives, but also came the negatives of we could be on our own and we could not be connected to a group. And we often discount just how much we kind of lost in that deal. So before the 19th century, if you look in texts, the word lonely is there, but it doesn't have the negative connotation. It merely means isolated. It wasn't until the Romantic period with actually Mary Shelley's Frankenstein where loneliness starts to be a very dark, negative concept.
Wait, with Frankenstein?
Mary Shelley's original book, Frankenstein, is one of the first times where you see the word lonely used in this really negative context.
Okay, and it's the monster who's lonely.
Absolutely.
Not the... All right, I'm going to have to think on this one for a little bit. One of the things that I've wondered a lot about is certainly in American culture, the concept of getting rich and wealthy and having high status involves what to me seems like very alone producing activities, right? I'm going to buy my own private island and live in this giant 100-room mansion with just my one spouse and my two kids, 5 miles away from the nearest person. Um, did you encounter any of that? And is that healthy? Is that not healthy? Does it have nothing to do with it because those people may still have very rich narrative lives?
I mean, theoretically they could, but this whole trend has actually been really problematic. Never before have, so many people lived on their own. It's just so many households are one people, and people don't feel those connections. We've become a much more status-based society, both in the United States and more globally. Part of this has been accelerated, by what are called parasocial relationships. This really started in the 20th century. This is Robert Putnam's work at Harvard, where basically when you think of the 1950s, you think of like bowling leagues and the Elk Lodge and, all these community groups that people were a part of. And like, that just seems archaic now. And what Putnam found was that it was television that really caused this huge shift in the decline in American communal activities, because we developed parasocial relationships. We actually began to have emotional connections to TV characters, and that sort of cannibalized part of our social time. There was a writer's strike in Hollywood in 2007, and so a lot of shows went off the air for a brief period of time. They stopped producing new episodes. And researchers looked like, what was the reaction of audiences? And what they found was it was basically the emotional equivalent of like a breakup for some people, because they had developed these emotional connections to these characters. And so in the 20th century, we had this decline in community because of parasocial relationships from television. Now, in the 21st century, we have social media, which again, you hear a lot of stuff about social media is good, social media is bad, social media is the devil. But there's one thing for certain, and that is it does have one negative effect, which it often eats into your social budget. The more time you spend, you generally don't sleep less because of social media. You generally don't work less because of social media. It comes out of your social time. So we are actually replacing face-to-face contact often with social media. And this was even before the pandemic. So we're seeing kind of this major shift and this loss of community. And that really does mean something. It's not just, it actually has concrete effects. For instance, one study actually right out of 2020 showed that if you have 5 friends, who like hub and spoke type relationship where they don't know each other, but you have 5 separate friends, that is actually you feel less support and less happiness than if you have 5 friends who all know each other, because that creates more of a community environment. If you're feeling upset or you're having problems, those friends can coordinate to work together to help you, to support you. So it does make a difference in terms of the concrete support we receive, but also the happiness we have to not only have friends, but also have something that resembles a community. And we've kind of been moving away from that because of the ease, of staying at home and social media and a desire for autonomy.
Well, I'll tell you one of the things. This is one of the things that's struck me about our increasing personalization from technology, because I am at least somewhat older than I look, and I remember the day back before we could carry around televisions in our pockets, and back when you had to watch things real time. You couldn't simply record them and then watch them at your leisure. And a lot of forms of media, even television, was still to some degree a communal experience. When I was an undergrad, we would have movies on campus every Friday and Saturday night, and you'd show up to the lecture hall where they would show the movie, because you had to go to a lecture hall. There was no way to watch them in your house. And there would be 5,000 other undergrads there, and it was like a giant party. And I went to one of these movies because they were endowed in perpetuity, so they still have the movies, and 3 people showed up in this lecture hall that could seat hundreds and hundreds of people. And I realized that on one hand, it's great to be able to get stuff that's streaming and that's exactly what you want when you want it, and it's personalized to you. But on the other hand, it took what used to be an experience that had a natural community element built in, and just kind of got rid of that part, as if as if that part wasn't important. And I'm guessing that no one, that it's just not something that has even really been talked about. So you did use a word there that I want to delve into a little bit. You used the word friend, and you said if you have 5 friends. You deconstructed the idea of friends in this book in a way that I have just never heard anyone do. Most people just use the word friend and assume that people know what that means. What does it mean? Tell us about friends.
It's really interesting because the love chapter of the book, like the challenge for me as a writer was that there's just so much research on love, marriage, and families that it was difficult to wade through. The challenge for the friends section of the book is that there's barely any research. There is some, but at first I was like, what am I going to do? And what was really funny was I expanded what I looked at. So I actually started to look as far back as ancient philosophy. And it was 2000 years ago that Aristotle first said that he defined a friend as another self, which is really kind of warm and poetic, but my book's a science book, so I had to keep reading. And what I found was that, in the past 50 years, research has actually shown Aristotle was right. Basically, to our brains, the closer we are to someone, the more our vision of ourself and our vision of that other person overlap like a Venn diagram. When you put women in an MRI scanner and you say their best friend's name, the areas for self-processing light up in their brain. If I ask you, is this personality trait true of you or true of your friend? It will take you longer to answer than if I ask you, is this personality trait true of this acquaintance or you? Because basically our brains sort of blur the lines. This is the more biological definition of what empathy is that we can't kind of see the difference to as clear a degree between where we stop and our closest friends and family start. And so it was really powerful to understand, this way, because I went down the rabbit hole in terms of looking at like, what is the nature of friendship? In a Darwinian world, why would we should be like most animals and only care about kin. But that's our brain's clever trick. Why friendship is so rewarding is that we see them like we see ourselves. And friendship is rewarding. Friends make us happier than any other relationship. This is research by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman. Basically, even in a marriage, the most happiness-inducing part of the marriage is the friendship between the two people. But friendship doesn't get the respect that the other relationships do. Friend gets used more than any other relational term in the English language, including mother and father. Yet, honestly, it's like the issue is friendship doesn't have an institution behind it. Your employer, you'll get fired if you don't maintain that connection. You can get divorced if you don't maintain that connection with your spouse. You'll go to jail if you don't take care of your children. But friendships, there's no institution backing them, so they typically don't get that respect. However, friendship's fragility proves its purity and its value in the sense that the reason friends make us so happy is because it's always a choice, never an obligation. If you don't like them, you don't have to spend time with them. It's always voluntary. And so this is why friends make us so happy. And yet we don't really do the things we need to do to maintain them. And that's kind of a sad state of affairs. We need to do more for our friends.
Well, so which in the introduction to the book, one of the things that you talked about, I don't know if it was introduction or first chapter, but that you got into the social psychology and the sciences of relationships in part because you yourself wanted to learn how to have better relationships, which is why I got into psychology too. I was a 19-year-old geek. I realized I had no social skills. I had no idea how to make friends. And I was like, oh, psychologists must have figured this out. Little did I know that most psychologists also don't seem to know how to make friends either. But so you're telling us that friends are important, that friends are, if anything, almost our primary relationship in the sense of how much we value them because they don't have this institutional support. They're largely voluntary. So if I want to have more friends or deepen my friendships, how do I do it?
Oh, the first spot I went to for that topic was Dale Carnegie, because I think that's what most people associate with making friends. And the interesting thing is, though, even though Carnegie's book was written before the dawn of most social science research, it's actually held up pretty well. The majority of what Carnegie said has, proven accurate. The only thing he got wrong was he said that we should try and see things from the other person's perspective. And research by Nicholas Epley at University of Chicago has shown we're terrible at this. In fact, trying to do that makes things worse because as opposed to listening, we make inaccurate assumptions. But by and large, Carnegie, it's really helpful. But the issue is Carnegie's work is only helpful for the beginning of relationships. It's really about the get to know you phase, because Carnegie wrote the book for business professionals who are trying to do networking, which is great, but it's not going to get us to the deep, fulfilling, meaningful friendships that we want. For that, we need to do what economics calls costly signals. We need to show and find costly signals, because everything Carnegie recommends is very easy to do. That's why we like it. It's simple. On the other hand, that also makes it kind of a playbook for con men, because it's all very easy and very shallow. What we need to do to develop deeper relationships is make these costly signals. The first one being time. I only have 24 hours a day. Time is scarce. That makes it costly. If I give you a lot of my time on a consistent basis, that is valuable. That shows that I'm very invested in this. I can't do that for everyone. The second is vulnerability. Is basically, a lot of people are always wondering, how do we create trust? And the research basically shows we create trust by demonstrating our trust. Not shallowly saying the words, I trust you, but demonstrating it. If I tell you things about me that might make me look bad, that could be used against me, that's really showing you, I'm saying, here's a weapon, you can use it against me. That shows I trust you. That shows that I consider you a safe person to talk to. And what we typically see is that when you open up and share that with people, people are likely to reciprocate. And not only do they reciprocate, but now you understand them better, they understand you better. We get very scared about opening up, and telling people how we feel, our fears, our weaknesses. Yet psychology has repeatedly demonstrated what's called the beautiful mess effect. And what that is that we kind of have this double standard where we're afraid if we say negative things like about our fears or weaknesses to others, that we'll just be exiled to a distant village. But when other people tell us their fears or weaknesses, we're generally pretty accepting of them. So we need to realize that people aren't usually as judgmental as we think. It's not as dangerous as we think. And opening up, being vulnerable, this has been shown, because basically small talk in long-term friendships hurts the relationship. It actually has been shown to show a decline in the quality of the relationship. And meanwhile, vulnerability is not just important for relationships. Robert Garfield at University of Pennsylvania did a study and found that not being open about your feelings and your fears, it prolongs the duration of minor illnesses, increases the chance of a first heart attack, and makes it more likely that first heart attack will be lethal. So, not being vulnerable won't just kill your relationships, it can also kill you.
Oh my gosh. All right. So I would imagine then that this would all carry over. We're talking about friendship right now, but it would carry over into sort of love and romance and marriage. And yeah. I found it interesting, number one, that you say in your book that, of course, that friendship seems to even trump marriage as a topic in terms of a type of relationship and frequency of discussion, et cetera, et cetera. What should we know about marriage itself and long-term relationships like that? Because, there's traditional marriage, leave it to Beaver and father knows best and so on and so forth. And that's kind of gone to a large degree. Have we lost something with that?
It's really interesting because in the book, I take a quick tour of the history of marriage, and marriage used to be, had a lot of rules, was very societally enforced, and it was the bedrock of a lot of communities and institutions. And so it was difficult to get divorced. There were very strong rules around, what you were supposed to do in marriage. And that made marriage very stable, but in many ways it was unequal, unfair, and often unhappy because it was so strict that people usually didn't end up married to the people that they were in love with. Usually marriage was often about getting the right in-laws, because if you think about it, you don't need marriage to fall in love. You don't need marriage to have kids. But, historically, developing associations with powerful families to protect your survival. I refer to the historical era as the help me not die marriage. You needed to do that to live. And that changed post-Enlightenment. People became more economically successful with the development of free markets. All of a sudden, autonomy was an option. And what you saw was marriage started to became more fulfilling as people were able to choose partners that they did love. People were able to kind of step back from some of the rules. People were able to get divorced. But the double-edged sword was, as marriage became more fulfilling, it also became less stable. And that's why, starting really accelerating in the 19th century and then exploding in the mid 20th century, we saw the divorce rate in the 1980s hit 50%. It's currently in the United States around 40%. And
Wow.
that number should be even higher, but it's not, because fewer people are getting married than ever. Now, that sounds really depressing, and I sound like the harbinger of just bad news. But there is a very, very positive flip side to that. And that is, though marriage may be less stable and less fulfilling for perhaps the majority of people, if you're at the top, Eli Finkel, who's a researcher at Northwestern University, calls marriage now the winner-take-all marriage. Basically, the people who have the happiest marriages today have the best marriages that have ever existed on this planet. Because marriage is fragile, but you can customize it. If you work hard at it, if you think about what you want, communicate with your partner, you can have one of the best marriages that has ever happened. But having a passive fairy tale vision of marriage, that may have worked in the past because there were a lot of forces conspiring to keep it together, to keep it ordered. Now you have to do the work. And if you don't do the work, there's severe downsides to divorce. So you really need to put in the effort. But again, it's winner take all. If you have a happy marriage, you're going to have one of the happiest marriages ever.
So tell me a little bit, because I am in a relationship that is a multi-decade relationship, and we are not legally married, gay couple, and so we got together way before it was legal, and if there was a legal form of marriage, we had to learn to make it work in that fashion. And I'm always amazed when I hear that anyone has ever broken up after the 10-year mark, because I'm kind of like, you put in the effort to make it 10 years. Oh my God. Like, what could possibly have broken you up at that point? Haven't you hit like every combination of things?
That's a sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost fallacy.
Damn, you caught me. Tell me, how do we increase the chances of making a relationship like that last? Because you said there are some really specific things you can do and things you cannot do.
Yeah,
the things that you should not do.
Absolutely. John Gottman is the leading researcher on marriage and love, and he's found there are I should start. Tolstoy once said that all unhappy families are alike, and all happy families are happy in their own way. It's the issue here though is that all unhappy couples are actually very similar. Most unhappy couples make the same four mistakes. This is what Gottman found, is that he calls them the four horsemen. And it's criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. And these four things predict divorce with about 83.3% accuracy. And, so avoiding these things is pretty critical. Criticism, like complaining, believe it or not, is actually good for a marriage, because if you raise issues, you can deal with them. But criticism is when you personalize it. So complaining is when I say you didn't take the trash out. Criticism is when I say you didn't take the trash out and you're always lazy and a dummy. So when you personalize it, that's really not a good idea. Defensiveness is when your partner raises something, and rather than responding to it and listening, you immediately shoot back with, well, you do this. And that doesn't resolve things. It escalates them. Stonewalling is when your partner raises an issue and you just shut down and you just kind of tune out. That drives the other person crazy. And then contempt is when you see your partner as less than you. And that is the single worst thing. Contempt is, Gottman called it sulfuric acid for love. It is the worst thing for a relationship. Now, by addressing those four, you can get pretty far. But The goal isn't to have a not negative relationship. I currently have a not negative relationship with every stranger on this planet. That's not love, and we often focus too much on fixing problems. The other thing we need to think about is how do we boost the positive? There's actually a lot of research that shows this is more important than fixing the negative, because Gottman found 69% of ongoing marital problems never get resolved. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, because that's true of happy and unhappy couples. You can't solve everything. You should try to regulate the conflict, not resolve every impossible conflict. But we need to boost the positive, have more fun together. People forget that. People think, oh, when we first started dating, we did all this fun stuff because we were in love. That's true. But the flip side is also true. You fell in love because you did a lot of fun, exciting stuff together. And when people cease to do that, and every night becomes another Netflix and pizza night, the positive emotion can start to drain away. It can drain away. It can even, entropically, it can kind of, turn negative. So what we need to do is basically add excitement. They did a study where they compared two cohorts. One was a group of couples who went on exciting dates. The other went on pleasant dates. Exciting one, hands down. Because in psychology, there's what's called emotional contagion. Basically, whatever is going on in the environment around us emotionally, we will come to associate with the person who is with us. So if we do fun, exciting things, we will come to associate that with our partner. This is how we can revitalize love, is instead of doing boring or negative things, to do positive things, and we can help to revitalize those feelings we originally had for our partner.
So what you're saying then is that if we take our partner who hates roller coasters, sling them over our shoulder, carry them onto the roller coaster, strap them in, sit next to them, that's the secret to a long-lasting marriage.
I think that you making all the decisions shows that you probably see yourself on a higher plane than your partner, and that would be indicative of contempt. So I think you might want to make things a little more democratic.
I'm doing it wrong again. Well, one of the things that I would have said prior to reading your book is one piece of a good marriage is really knowing and understanding what the other person wants. And I would almost say this is even true of a lot of work relationships and so on. And then I read your book about understanding what other people want. And I'm kind of like, oh, you can't even profile a serial killer, much less someone you love deeply. In our last few minutes, could you just give us some thoughts about what it means to understand what someone wants, and in the context of a relationship, how do you do that or not do that, etc.? Because to me, that was just a fascinating and completely unexpected thing that I learned.
Yeah. In the first section of the book, I talk about that. And again, this was work by Nicholas Epley, where basically when we're trying to read the thoughts and feelings of strangers, we're only accurate 20% of the time. With friends, we hit 30%. With spouses, we hit 35%. So whatever you think is on your spouse's mind, 2/3 of the time you're wrong. We're really bad at not reading people, but we can get better. I talk about many things we can use, but relevant to what you were saying specifically about marriage, there is this other really esoteric, crazy technique called ask them. And we can ask people, about what's on their mind, what they want. And this Gottman found this is extremely powerful. He called it love maps, to basically really get to know your partner, not just the little things. Ask them about the big, vague things. What does love mean to you? What does marriage mean to you? What does happiness mean to you? Those are tough questions. But when you get those answers from your partner, it's like getting the answers to the test. You can start to say, oh, here's how I feel, here's how you feel. Here's how we can honor both of our definitions of happiness and love. You can really start to see, oh, now I know why they're getting upset, because to them, doing household chores is an expression of love. To me, that it's not like that, but now I understand why this turned into an argument. So to really ask those questions, to get to know them, it allows you to really avoid the worst thing that can happen in a long-term relationship, which Gottman calls negative sentiment override. This is when the idealization of early love flips. And basically we start to see our partner, we start to make negative assumptions about them. And this is terrible. We avoid that by talking, by understanding, by communicating. A lot of people get scared of this, but like I said, complaining is a positive for a marriage. It's criticism that's difficult for a marriage. You need to talk. Sometimes you're going to fight, but that's necessary. As Gottman quipped, he said, if you're in a long-term relationship and you've never had a big fight, please do that immediately.
I like that idea, assuming, of course, you can make it through it to the other side. But one of the most transformative things in my relationship, which I think was a major stepping stone in the longevity piece, and we didn't discover this until after being together for over 10 years, was almost what you just said, is that I interpret things like someone else cleaning the kitchen as being an act of love towards me. They are showing their love by making my life easier.
Yeah.
It's not that way for my partner. My partner likes to talk. And that's how it's like, oh, I know that you love me if we spend 4 hours together talking about that, right? I'm an introvert. Never occurred to me that would indicate love.
Has any value whatsoever. You know?
Right.
No, I mean that's why communicating those things, like I said, you got the answers to the test. You know, all of a sudden problems that seemed inexplicable that may have led you to think, oh, they're just acting crazy. Like, this makes no sense. There must be in a mood. No, when you talk to them and you learn stuff like that, now it doesn't seem crazy. Now it's like, everybody doesn't feel exactly the same way I do. Wow, I never would have predicted that. You know, you can actually start to say to yourself, here's what they want. I know I need to do this. This is what makes them happy. You know, and they understand you better. So it's really important. And I think people really get out of that habit. They start making assumptions, and that can be really bad at times.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. We're pretty much out of time. If people want to read the book, which I can hold up here, Plays Well with Others by Eric Barker. If they want to find you, subscribe to your, I don't know if you have a Substack these days. I know you certainly have a blog.
Yeah, my blog is still active and going. The URL is a little tricky for most people to spell. So if people go to ericbarker.org, ERICBARKER.org, that's where I go. And basically on a weekly basis, I post up research, social science and psychology research on how to make your life awesome. So the best way to follow what I've been up to is to sign up for my weekly newsletter.
Awesome. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Thank you.